Today, we're going to try and make sense of the Middle East crisis by taking a snapshot of just a single day, September 3rd, 2025, based on reports from The Guardian. We'll look at the human toll, the military actions on the ground, and the reactions from all over the world, including from inside Israel itself. So let's dive in. To really get a handle on the events of this day, you have to start with the human cost. And the reports lead with one statistic that it puts everything else into a really stark perspective.
And that number is this, 21,000.
So what does that number mean? Well, according to a United Nations committee, that's the number of children in Gaza, at least 21,000, who've been left with a disability since the war began. I mean, just think about that. It suggests an entire generation is being physically and emotionally altered on a scale that's just hard to wrap your head around.
And just so you know where this is coming from, this isn't some random estimate. The data is from the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These are international experts whose entire job is to monitor these exact kinds of rights. So we're talking about official monitoring here.
But that staggering number is really just one piece of a much bigger, much darker picture that the report paints. Beyond that, there are over 40,000 children with new war-related injuries. In just the last day, another 6 people, including a child, died from malnutrition. That brings the total for malnutrition alone to 367, and more than a third of those are children. And on top of all that, for this specific Tuesday, another 113 Palestinians were reported killed.
The head of the UN's relief agency, Philippe Lazzarini, put it in terms that are, they're incredibly blunt. He said, Gaza is becoming the graveyard of international humanitarian law. And he warns that the precedents being set right now could become the new norm for all future conflicts. Okay, so with that humanitarian backdrop, let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at the specific military actions that were reported on the ground on this day, with a real focus on what was happening in Gaza City. This gives you a really granular look at what was happening in just one of Gaza's most crowded neighborhoods, Sheikh Radwan. According to residents who spoke to Reuters, they described an Israeli military push with tanks, and tents were set ablaze. They also reported grenades being dropped on 3 schools being used as shelters, which caused displaced Palestinians to flee yet again. And a medical clinic was bombed, destroying 2 ambulances. It just paints a chaotic picture of the fighting, right down to the street level. So what's the official reasoning for these operations? Well, the Israeli military put out a statement clarifying its objective. It said it would continue to operate against terrorist organizations in Gaza and work to remove any threat to Israel. So that's the stated strategic goal behind the actions on the ground. And of course, you have the immediate human toll from overnight strikes. This was being tracked by local hospitals. And if you just look at reports from 3 of them, you can see the numbers of bodies they received: 10 at Nasser Hospital, 14 at Al-Shifa, and 1 at Al-Quds. So a really natural question you might be asking is, why don't civilians just leave these active combat zones? And, according to a humanitarian group, it's not that simple. It's incredibly complex. People are reluctant to move for a whole mix of reasons. There's the fear that if they leave, they'll never be able to come back. There's sheer exhaustion from being displaced over and over again. Plus, it's expensive, and frankly, there's just a lack of safe places for them to even go. Okay, so let's zoom out now from the ground level to the global stage. How is the international community responding to all of this? As the reports from this one day show pretty clearly, the world is deeply divided. And you can really see that division right here. On one side, you've got nations like France, Spain, and the UAE calling for restraint. The UAE even labeled West Bank annexation a red line. But on the other side, key Israeli ministers are pushing in the complete opposite direction. The finance minister is calling for that very annexation, and the defense minister is framing a new spy satellite as a clear message to all our enemies. 2 totally different approaches. But it's not just external pressure. The reporting from this day also shines a pretty bright light on some serious internal tensions inside Israel itself. We're talking about widespread public dissent spilling out onto the streets. Protesters organized what they called a day of disruption, and they had a really clear 4-part message. First, denouncing the massive call-up of reservists. Second, demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. Third, calling for the release of Israeli hostages. And finally, demanding the government's resignation. And you can really feel just how tense this internal climate is in a statement from opposition leader Yair Lapid. While he condemned destructive acts by protesters, he immediately followed it with what he called a greater condemnation of the government for abandoning hostages. That one sentence really shows you how tangled up and politically charged these domestic issues have become.
So, after taking in the humanitarian crisis, the military actions, and the divided reactions from both outside and inside Israel, where does this single day of reporting leave us? What is this new normal that seems to be emerging? Well, it seems to boil down to this kind of dual reality. On one track, you have a deepening humanitarian crisis documented by the UN and aid groups. And on a completely parallel track, you have intensifying military and political strategies. These two things are happening at the exact same time, often in direct and really tragic conflict with one another. And that brings us to our final critical question, echoing that warning from the UNRW chief we heard earlier. As we see these dire warnings about humanitarian law becoming a reality on the ground, what will the world ultimately come to accept as the new norm for future conflicts? That's the really sobering thought that this day's events leave us all to consider.